People often talk about the term natural disasters, but as we are emitting more and more greenhouse gases, we're slowly influencing the climate. And so even things like the weather that have previously been outside the influence of humans are now becoming influenced by humans. I do think that changes how people think and feel about the weather. We now don't perceive it as a natural phenomenon at all times anymore. Hiya, could I have an Americano with coconut milk, please? I'm Shireen Amis, and I'm a DPhil student in atmospheric physics and a research assistant in climate damages.
Hello, it's Friday the 22nd of July, 2050, and it's been another extremely hot day across the UK.
With how humans are changing the climate, what would the weather look like in the future?
Exceeding 40 degrees and a top temperature of 43 in Worcester. And with the combination of high daytime and high nighttime temperatures, the most severe heat health warning is currently in force. Cancellations of several big events this weekend. The travel disruption that we've seen over the last few days is likely to worsen this weekend. Temperatures in Delhi reached 48 Celsius today, meaning a real risk to life for people who can't escape the heat by staying in a cooled environment indoors. If you are spending time outdoors, remember, stay hydrated, dress appropriately for the weather, and slow down when it is hot.
At what point do you say you're responsible for this? A lot of people are actually becoming very aware of climate change, changing our daily experience of the weather. So our main goal is to understand extreme weather events better and the dynamics that are driving them. With climate change, the dynamics in the atmosphere are changing, and that can change certain types of weather events such as heat waves, but also storms. And so we're looking at how that is exactly happening. Because I am working in both the physics department and with the Sustainable Law Programme in Oxford, on the one hand, it is very much about understanding the extreme events, and then on the other hand, it's about the implications that that has for society. So event attribution is the science of analysing whether and how much climate change has impacted certain extreme weather events. So you might have a heat wave and you would be interested in whether that heat wave has become hotter with climate change or whether it's now more frequent with climate change. Certainly the line of causality with extreme events can be quite convoluted, sometimes more complicated to find than it would be in a very simple case. But if we went back in time, took the greenhouse gases that we emitted out of the atmosphere, we can find what kind of weather events would be more likely to happen in a warmer or colder climate.
We could try and demonstrate it using a deck of cards. And if you think of the red ones representing warm events and the blue ones, the more colder weather events, if we look at weather forecast, we would probably start by mixing these cards up. As a simple demonstration of the rather complex physics that's behind weather forecast models, let's say we pick cards from those as possible realizations, as possible forecasts of how the weather is going to be. Think of a world where anthropogenic climate change wouldn't have happened. we would end up with a distribution of these events that would give us roughly equal chance of getting warmer or cold event. We could do this lots of times, and this is actually what we do in weather forecasts, and we get quite good quality predictions from those. In the case of increased greenhouse gases towards warmer conditions, we would remove from our deck of cards some of the cold ones, some of the blue cards. We randomly draw again, and we end up with a forecast that perhaps looks a bit more like this. More red cards coming up here. Further increase the greenhouse gases, meaning we're removing more and more of these blue cards in our set. We're getting less and less of these colder realizations, colder possibilities. And if we go to very, very extreme scenarios where the forcing from the greenhouse gases is getting really, really strong, we're removing more of these cards. And what we end up with is an increased chance of more warm events in our predictions. And because of our prediction with the weather systems being tested so well, we're quite confident that this model can represent the physics that's involved in climate change.
Yeah, and I mean, we see quite nicely here as well that the blue cards are getting rarer and rarer, and we're getting more of the hot event cards in our stacks as we introduce more climate change. So, yeah. What we do with the model is reconstructing the extreme event in a warmer or colder climate, where we only take the emissions out that we have actually produced, and then see a difference in the extreme event that we're looking at. I don't think it's always necessarily about wanting to be a climate scientist when you're 5 years old. I started physics maybe wanting to be an astrophysicist, being really interested in particle physics, and then while I was studying realized that maybe I was more interested in fields that would have a societal impact as well, and so I got into environmental physics because of that. And so I think it's often about using the skills that you have and finding out how you can use them in a way that is actually making people's lives better. I do have a degree in physics. Through that, I've come to work on extreme weather events because I think they're a fascinating scientific challenge. I really do enjoy just the science of it, and the modelling aspect I find just like, in a way, almost calming, because then you can forget about climate change happening, and it's just about you sitting at your computer and figuring out how to get the model to work, which is actually quite fun. There are a large number of climate litigation cases underway at the moment. They often focus on the impacts that the weather is having on humans on the ground. Hi Rupert, nice to see you again.
Good morning, Shireen.
So could you tell me a bit more about how you look at weather events and how they're changing with climate change in the Sustainable Law Programme?
Sure. So at the Sustainable Law Programme, we build on Oxford's expertise in climate change attribution science to understand better the extent to which human influence on the climate, that is, greenhouse gas emissions, is affecting the weather we see around the world and other aspects of the climate system, like our retreating glaciers. We're interested in what do these findings mean in the courts? How can we be informative to judges' decision-making in the cases that are increasingly being put in front of them?
Do you have an example of a case that you worked on before?
Sure.
The scenic high Andes of northern Peru are melting due to rising temperatures. And this Peruvian farmer believes RWE, a German energy giant, is responsible.
So one case in the German courts was brought by Mr. Saul Lucia. He's a Peruvian farmer, and back in 2015, he went to court in Germany arguing that RWE, the largest emitter in Europe, should be held responsible for their contribution to certain climate change impacts in Peru. That Mr. Luya lives in the city of Huaraz, a city high up in the Peruvian Andes, but just below a very large lake. The valley used to be full of a glacier, and the glaciers retreated a mile up the mountain. And in the wake of its retreat, now this huge lake sits and threatens to burst onto the city below it.
For nearly a decade now, he has legally challenged the company, demanding RWE pay for the protection of his city of Huaraz from the imminent risk of flooding and overflow from Lake Palcacocha.
And what we were able to show was that in the absence of climate change, this simply would not have been the problem that it is today. Climate change is entirely responsible for the retreat of this particular glacier, and as a consequence, this flood risk poses a serious risk to the lives of many of the people of Huaraz. Mr. Luya argues that RWE should pay part of the costs of protecting the city against this devastating event, about 0.5% of the total cost, because they're responsible for about 0.5% of historical emissions.
The Higher Regional Court of Hamm in Germany will issue a verdict in this landmark case brought by Luya.
Fossil fuel companies have essentially not had to pay for the consequences of their greenhouse gas emissions. Cases like this could entirely put that on its head. Frankly, the profitability of the fossil fuel industry largely hinges on them not having to pay for the consequences of their greenhouse gas emissions. And cases like this could start to change that equation.
As we realise that we are changing the weather with our emissions, the responsibility is then also more and more on us to create a more promising future for our weather and for ourselves.
A landmark verdict after a decade-long legal battle now opens legal avenues for people worldwide directly affected by climate change. This ruling does send a strong warning to companies continuing to emit large amounts of greenhouse gases.
Ultimately, our science is really trying to help people on the ground cope better